Number 1.
What would you do if you were alone in a dark place? Not even a strange place, some place familiar to you, like your own basement or garage, and you happen to see 2 points of light glinting at you from across the room. Would your fight or flight instinct immediately kick in? Or would you freeze, unable to move, because of the shock and terror weighing you down? Back in 2010, I had this experience firsthand, though unfortunately not in a place that was familiar to me. At the time, I didn't know if I would ever see daylight again. I live in Auckland, New Zealand, which is located on the Northern Island. I have a degenerative bone disease that weakens me. It makes me even more frail with every passing year. At the time, I had just been diagnosed and decided to try to live my life to the fullest. I had a friend named Jacoby who was a big-time conspiracy nut. He didn't have a cell phone or a bank account and made some money here and there by showcasing his sidewalk chalk art. I asked him what he would do if his days were numbered. He said that he would find a spot untouched by man and mark his name on a rock. I decided to take his advice and do some cave exploration in the Northland. But I didn't want to visit just any tourist trap cave. I wanted to visit a cave that most people didn't know about. Jacoby and I did some research and made contact with a few hardcore outdoor type guys and discovered that there was a small cave that very few people knew about because it was incredibly difficult to get to. We met up with a couple of guys named Ben and Angus who knew where the cave was, and we put together a group of 6 people to go exploring. I knew the idea of a guy with brittle bones going exploring in caves doesn't sound like a brilliant idea. I had at least 4 people pointing that out to me, but I badly wanted to experience it as soon as possible before I grew too weak to climb a staircase. Ben warned us that where we were going, there was a very small chance of a rescue in case of an emergency, and that we would be all on our own. I said my goodbyes to my immediate family and started the trip at dawn. By 10 a.m., we reached the spot where we would have to leave our car, and by midday, we were deep in the heart of the New Zealand wilderness. Angus forged the path ahead with a machete. I followed immediately after with Jacoby and my other friend Elijah, carrying the tents, water, and first aid, while Ben and another guy named Mark followed behind. All things considered, I was feeling very well despite my condition, and was able to keep pace with the others as the day wore on. Every once in a while, we would pass a tree with a weird symbol carved into it, and Jacoby would go on about how some alien race had probably landed there back in World War II after the Nazis failed to colonize Antarctica. I just rolled my eyes. That was the kind of conspiracy theory noise he was always going on about. We let him keep talking because he provided us with some unintended laughs. By nightfall, we were nearly at the cave, so we set up camp and built a fire. And then Ben used a flashlight to lead us to the cave's entrance. We cracked some celebratory beers as we shone the lights deep into the depths of the cave, the floor slanting downwards at a nearly 60-degree angle. We had just finished our beers and cigars, and were all about to head back to camp for the night, when we all heard something echo deep down within the cave. It sounded like a rock had shifted and rolled a bit. Nothing too exciting, but the faint noise was enough to get Jacoby going. He went on about how the Draconians were nearby, and they were hidden in their invisible cloaking devices, like Predator, and we were all in their crosshairs. Ben then screamed into the night that Jacoby was our leader, and his head was the one they wanted, which got us all laughing. We headed back to camp, but as I turned to follow the others up the path, I glanced down into the darkness of the cave, and for a split second, I thought I saw a pair of eyes glinting up at me, reflecting off the night sky before disappearing. A chill passed over me, but I immediately shook it off, convinced that I was just seeing things, and I didn't even tell the others. The following morning, we anchored 2 lines at the mouth of the cave and steadily made our way down, holding onto the ropes for support. Once at the bottom, there was a small cavern with 2 massive rocks that were pinned against each other that we had to crawl under in order to continue deep into the cave. We each had 2 flashlights, water, and were each tied to another person so no one could get lost. Mark and I were attached to each other's belts by a cord, and together we made our way in front of the others and deeper into the dark, rocky void. I'm not sure how many of you have been deep underground, but it's a thrilling yet terrifying experience. You can almost feel the weight of the earth crushing down upon you from above. The air is extremely stale and dusty, and absolutely everything echoes. We got used to keeping our voices low as we spoke. All in all, we were underground for a good several hours, pausing every so often to take a breather, but for the most part continuing to push onward down the twisting, winding cavern. We reached a section of the cave where it was too narrow to go any further, as the crack in the wall was barely big enough to fit me moving sideways. I took out a spray can and marked my initials on a rock, and then began the rough uphill climb with Mark back to the others. We had been out front the entire time, and we were heading back from what we had assumed to be a dead end. So imagine my shock when from the darkness behind us came the faintest sound of what sounded like short, sharp intakes of breath. Mark and I both heard it and turned back around, shining our lights back down the way we had come from. But we didn't see anything. Mark made a comment that it had to be the sound of air moving through a crack in the wall, and we kept moving. After 2 minutes or so I paused, positive I heard the sound again, which didn't make sense, because if it was really just air coming through a crack, we would have been out of earshot by now. I glanced behind me again and nearly gasped out loud. This is going to sound incredibly cliché, but I saw them again. 2 pale eyes barely discernible staring back at me from the shadows. In that moment, I thought of screaming and telling Mark to run, but I forced myself to keep a straight face as I turned back around and continued climbing. I thought about dogs being able to tell when humans are afraid and attacking if they ran. In my mind, whatever was behind me was keeping its distance for now, hesitant to get too close. But if we started to run, the thing might have felt emboldened and started to chase us. For the next half an hour, Mark and I made our way back through the cave, me glancing over my shoulder every 5 minutes, but I didn't see the eyes again. When we met up with Ben and Elijah, I didn't say anything about the eyes. I was terrified that if I said anything, they might have wanted to retrace our steps and get a closer look. We made our way back to the mouth of the cave, much more slowly than I would have liked. And after another hour or so of carefully watching our footing, we emerged from the cave's mouth and back out into the daylight, which nearly blinded me. It took another 40 minutes before Angus and Jacoby clambered out, and in that time, I was having a nervous breakdown, convinced that the unseen thing had grabbed them in the dark. Turns out Angus had taken a fall and scraped up his leg, and they had to move slowly. Even after we returned to camp, started a fire and cooked dinner, I kept my mouth shut. Everyone was in a good mood and having fun. I didn't want to cause concern or suspicion bringing up the eyes. Now that I was back out in daylight, I was starting to convince myself that I had never seen them at all. That night I had trouble sleeping. I tossed and turned in my tent for so long that I actually caused the tent to detach from its lining and collapse in on itself. I cursed and struggled in the dark to find the zipper and free myself. When I finally poked my head out of the tangle of cloth, I froze. Right at the edge of the campsite, staring directly at me, were the eyes, closer than they had ever been. I felt around in the dark until I found the flashlight, and without breaking eye contact, I turned it on, keeping my hand pressed over the light. The eyes were still there, unmoving, unblinking, and in that moment, I had my chance to shine the light directly on the thing, but I didn't. I couldn't. After maybe a minute, the eyes disappeared, and I heard a rustling in the undergrowth. I stayed dead still for what seemed like a small eternity, and eventually passed out from exhaustion. The next morning, Jacoby woke me and pointed out fresh marks on a tree right at the edge of the campsite where I had seen the eyes. 3 vertical cuts with a 4th horizontal one underneath. Jacoby was convinced the draconian race had visited us, but when I made eye contact with Ben, he looked disturbed, and from the look in his eyes, I got the sense that he was familiar with whatever I had seen the night before. Perhaps he had seen it too. We packed up and left, and we all made it back safely. I can't really describe why I didn't point the light at the eyes. I guess a part of me was terrified of what I would see. I suppose it could have been nothing, or something that was laughably obvious and unthreatening. But I don't think so. I believe that it was more than nothing. I believe it was something. Something I couldn't describe even if I had seen it in the light. I haven't been exploring since. I still live in New Zealand, but my condition has gotten worse, and I am now bound to a wheelchair. Regardless of that scare, I'm glad I took the trip. I still talk to Jacoby every now and then, and even though I would never admit it, maybe some of those far-out conspiracy theories aren't as crazy as I once thought. Number 2.
Last summer, my girlfriend and I decided to spend about a month completely off the grid. We left our cell phones and credit cards in a lockbox at my mother's house and started walking right off her back porch and into the Colorado wilderness. We were each carrying a knapsack full of clothes, food and water, a first aid kit, some tools, and a single tent. We also had our driver's licenses on us in case the worst happened, and our bodies needed to be identified. The first week or so was rough because it rained almost every hour of every day, but we adjusted and came to appreciate the simplicity of the outdoors and the joy of not needing to stare at a screen all day. We spent a lot of time just talking, enjoying deep conversations and each other's company. We enjoyed the scenic views, climbed some trees, stacked some small rocks as high as we could, and bathed in streams. We saw plenty of wild animals and woke every morning with the dawn. I had a full beard going after about 2 weeks and was pretty positive I was looking more homeless than rugged, but my girlfriend thought it suited me, which made it more tolerable. At the very beginning of the 3rd week, it got unseasonably cold and we set up our tent in the mouth of a large cave. We made a fire outside the tent opening and bundled up under some blankets inside the tent. We spent the day mostly napping and telling each other embarrassing childhood stories. When night came, we were playing blackjack on the tent floor, the fire still raging outside when we both paused and looked up at each other. We had both heard it at the exact same moment. There were heavy footsteps coming around the side of the hill towards the cave. The only weapon we had on us was a hatchet for cutting firewood, so my girlfriend grabbed it immediately. I unzipped the tent flap fully and poked my head out, expecting any moment for a random hiker to walk into the light of our fire. I was more surprised than alarmed, mostly because we hadn't seen anyone even from a distance since we had walked off my mother's porch a couple weeks before, but I figured if we could travel that far into the sticks, other people could too. At the sound of the zipper, the footsteps stopped, and for about a solid 2 minutes, I didn't hear anything. I called out, "Hello?" and climbed out of the tent to peek outside the cave, but I didn't see anyone. There was no moon that night, and everything beyond the light of our fire was essentially one giant black shadow. After another minute or so, I idly picked up a small rock and threw it out to the cave in the direction I thought I heard the footsteps, hoping to catch the sound of someone reacting, but nothing came. I eventually climbed back into the tent and decided that whoever or whatever it had been, they were gone now, and we could get back to playing our card game. My girlfriend wasn't as convinced and insisted on us leaving the tent flap open and keep the fire going strong. After maybe 5 minutes, there came a sharp rapping of stone on stone from outside the tent, and we both leapt to our feet. We just happened to see the stone I had just thrown out of the cave rolling to a stop in the faint darkness beyond our tent. My girlfriend started cussing and yelling, grabbed the flashlight and the hatchet, and demanded whoever was out there to show themselves. Just to be safe, I grabbed our second flashlight and walked as far back into the cave as I could, to make sure no one else was lurking back there. No one was, but I found a massive pile of leaves and branches back into the farthest corner of the darkness that definitely had not collected there naturally because of the wind. We were in someone's or something's lair. My girlfriend adamantly refused to leave the cave and ventured out into the darkness, So we planted our feet, kept the fire going, and for the entire rest of the night we kept our eyes focused on the darkness outside, watching and listening, waiting for something to happen. But aside from a few owls, we never heard anything else of any kind. We were all packed up by the time dawn broke. We left the cave and immediately made for higher ground. We set up a new camp nestled at the very top of a steep incline against 2 boulders, so anything following us would have had to come uphill to reach us. We slept for about 6 hours, and by the time we woke up, we both felt pretty foolish about being so worried. When we climbed out of the tent to cook some food, we noticed the charred remains of a burned log stuck vertically into the ground about 20 feet away from the tent opening. It was one of the logs we had burned and left behind in the cave. We have no explanation as to how it got there. So that's my story. Most people I tell it to are convinced someone else was stalking us, trying to freak us out. And while that's possible, it seems unlikely to me. It wouldn't have explained the makeshift bed we found in the cave, and it would have taken a lot of stealth and effort to follow us that deep into the wilderness without being noticed. I personally don't know what to think, but I will admit that there's a lot of unexplored forest out there amongst those hills. Who knows what could be living unseen in the forgotten corners of the world.
Number 3. The following story is told from the point of view of a female. Back in the early 2000s, I had just graduated from high school and was spending the first few days of summer camping out in the woods on my grandfather's property in Maine. I was with my 2 best friends, Heather and Kim, all of us being big outdoor enthusiasts who enjoy climbing up trees and lying out under the stars at night. On the second day of our camping trip, we decided to take our tent deeper into the woods, so we wouldn't be able to see my grandfather's house anymore. We liked the idea of feeling alone and independent. After we set up the tent, we started a game of Capture the Flag, where we each had a different colored towel that we got to hide in plain sight, either up a tree or in a hole somewhere, and then we would search for our opponent's towel and try to get it back to home base, which was the tent. I wasn't very good at winning this game, and I was determined to go the extra mile this time. The rules were that the flag had to be visible enough so the color stood out at a short distance, but I was going to bend the rules a bit and hide the flag in a small cave I knew was nearby. Both girls were unlikely to venture too far into this cave to look. I had been to this cave several times and referred to it as Tiger Lily's Cave, like the character from Peter Pan. It was small and narrow, and you had to crouch to walk in. But I didn't mind risking the cobwebs in my hair. I went as far back into the cave as I could, and dropped the bright green towel on the ground, visible enough if you walked deep enough into the cave you would find it, when I noticed something. Just beyond the edge of the daylight, streaming through the entrance, I saw a glittering against the sun. I figured that it was a coin or something. I moved in to take a closer look. I discovered that it was a buckle on a strap of a man's suspenders. The end with the buckle was lying on the leaves, as motionless as a dead snake. The other end of the suspender was attached to the pants of a man's body, lying face down in the ground. His head was wrapped up tightly in a plastic bag. I shrieked and ran back outside the cave, and kept screaming for my friends until they came running. I told them I found a body with a plastic bag over his head, and all 3 of us immediately went back into the cave. And in the semi-darkness, we all started speaking very fast and very loud, arguing whether it was real, and how could it have gotten there. It was Heather who pointed out that this was a victim of murder, and we had to get out of there, as the murderer could return. We ran back out of the cave as fast as we could, while crouched over, and then sprinted back to my grandfather's house, who, go figure, wasn't even home. I called my mom from the kitchen phone, and she told us to call the police. By the time my mom, my grandfather, and the 2 policemen had all arrived, 40 minutes had gone by. We led them with much more confidence and excitement than fear back to Tiger Lily's cave, where I immediately noticed that the leaves had been disturbed. One of the policemen crouched down and wandered in with a flashlight, and after a few minutes called out to our group that there was no body, but plenty of dried blood. and clear evidence that something heavy had been dragged out. He emerged from the cave holding my bright green towel. There was a few smears of blood showing against the fabric. We immediately were sent back home. In the next 12 hours or so were a circus of people walking back and forth in and out of the woods. About a dozen more cops arrived with dogs to track whoever removed the corpse. I remember us all grilling out on the back deck and watching the cops walking in and out of the woods. A few of them even ate with us and filled us in on a few details. By the next day, most of them were gone. One police car was stationed on the street by my grandfather's driveway to keep an eye on things, but no reporters ever came to interview us, and we never heard anything about it on the news. I gave the best description of the body that I could, but given that it was dark and there was a bag over the man's head, the best I could do was describe the suspenders and shirt. After another week or so, the police released the scene, and we never heard from them again. We never found out what happened to the body or who dragged it away. My grandfather has since died, but his property was sold to a family I know very well, and since then I have taken my kids to the cave for them to explore. It's one of the most exciting and mysterious childhood memories of mine. Finding a body in a spooky cave in the Maine wilderness. That's the stuff Stephen King novels are built on. What's up everyone, Uncle Unit here. I hope you enjoyed today's video. I want to give a very special thanks to Southern Cannibal for helping me out with these stories. He's a gifted storyteller and a very good friend of mine. He really does care about the quality of his content, and he also cares a lot about his fans, which I really admire. I would greatly appreciate it if you took the time and checked out his channel. And also, if you haven't checked out my last video where I did monster stories, I'll leave a link to that on the outro screen. Thanks again for tuning in. And as always, never forget.
There's always a reason to be afraid.